It has been an awesome weekend. The Friday night, Good Friday service, Friday night was awesome. Super attended, so thankful for everybody being here. Yesterday with the family cookout, the egg hunt, it's just a tremendous crowd there and just everything. Sunrise service at Tice Cemetery this morning, well attended, just a great time. And then today, all the things that we're getting to experience and be a part of today, just we're really blessed on this Easter weekend. You know, I'm not a world traveler by any stretch of the imagination. I'm very kind of a limited, you might say I'm not even a United States traveler. I hadn't went a whole lot of places, but I'm thankful for some of the things I've got to do, you know, some sporting events that I've been to, and actually, you know, history was made, and I was able to look back and say, hey, I was there when those things happened in some races, and got to go to the Masters one time and the Memorial in Ohio. It's just those good things there. But can you imagine, even begin to imagine what it would be like to have been there on the Sunday morning that Jesus rose from the dead? You know, we try to do a good job when we come to the Lord's table. We remember the death of Jesus or his sacrifice. The Friday night service, the Good Friday service, was all about trying to put us in that frame of mind where to kind of try to get a feeling of what Jesus went through and all of that. That's what, you know, the Friday night service is all about that. But can you even imagine what Easter Sunday morning would be like? To have seen the women come up to the tomb and just to see them see the stone had been rolled away. Or the angel on the rock, on the stone had been rolled away. Or when they ran back to tell the disciples, the looks on the disciples' face when the women told them his body isn't there. He's gone. When they ran and they looked in that tomb, I would have loved to have seen the Pharisees' faces. When the word got to them, his body is gone. Let me tell them what happened. I'm sure if we would have been there in real time, real moment, we couldn't have understood that everything changed. That nothing would ever be the same. It was a pivotal point in history. Everything hinged on that. Christianity rises and falls, stands and falls on the validity of Jesus coming back to life. Paul was writing to some Christians in the city of Corinth who had the idea that there was no resurrection from the dead. It kind of sounds strange that you're a Christian but not believing that you could rise from the dead. And Paul's writing to them to tell them the importance of that in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 13 and 14 says this: if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. Let that sink in for just a minute. It's useless, and so is your faith. That's how pivotal the resurrection of Jesus Christ is. And it's bad. I hope I say this right and you don't misunderstand. As bad as Friday was, for what they did to Jesus and how darkness reigned for that time, as bad as that was, Sunday morning and Jesus rising from the dead, it's almost like it just fades out. Everything is worth it. Jesus is alive. You look back and that is how big that Sunday morning was. This is the final week of our series that we've been calling Why. We've just been asking questions why certain things happen that final week of Jesus' life on this earth. And we have to ask the why question this week. Why did Jesus come back to life? Why is it such a pivotal thing in history? Why is it a pivotal point in the gospel message? Why couldn't Jesus just have died? We know that, and he know that we crucified our sins and just gone back to heaven. Why did we need a Sunday if we'd already had a Friday? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, but I just want to talk a few minutes about two of them. We needed Jesus rising from the dead to demonstrate life after death, or life over death. It doesn't matter who you are, when you were born in history, what culture you were from, what nation you lived in. It just doesn't matter. People have asked the question from the beginning of time, what happens when I die? What happens to people when they die? And the theories and the beliefs and the teachings are from every range, from that there's nothing after this life here. When you die, you die. We're no different than a possum that's been run over and left on the side of the road. That's just it. All the way to people who believe and teach in reincarnation. And reincarnation says that you just come back, your soul comes back and inhabits another living being, another living something. And I don't believe in reincarnation by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have to admit, I've seen a few people that are married to some guy, and I go, what did they do in their previous life to get stuck with him? And this, like, I'm saying, I just, thought just comes in my mind, but we know that isn't true. And there's a belief that the spirits, they're still out there just walking around, and psychics and mediums, they can talk to them. They can conjure them up. There's several television shows on that's kind of along the idea of finding Bigfoot, and they're trying to find the ghosts and the spirits, and they're always that close to finding them. And they just can't ever quite get them. Why did the women go to the tomb? That Sunday morning, why did they go to the tomb where Jesus was buried? Mark 16, verses 1 through 3 says this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? These women were fantastic followers of Jesus. They had supported him and his ministry all through it. They had stood up and stood for Jesus when the men ran. It says that they were there when Jesus was crucified, when some of the men had run away. So they were awesome followers of Jesus Christ. But even them were not going to the tomb to see if he had risen from the dead. They were going to anoint his body with the spice. See, it says the Sabbath was quickly approaching when Jesus died, and they had to get him in the tomb, and to keep the Sabbath, they couldn't work, and so they didn't have the time to anoint the body, prepare it, do everything they wanted to do. So now that the Sabbath was over, they go back. They were doing this out of respect, to care for the body. Not every time, but most of the time when I go back to visit family and such in Martinsville, I'll go by the cemetery where my mom, my dad, my grandparents, some aunts, uncles, best friend, all just happen to be buried in this same cemetery. And I'll stop by there and just go kind of check on the graves, and like I can do anything, but it's just something I do. I go by there. And this was some years ago, where my mom is buried. It's on the side of a hill, and a big tree is there, and it's just grown over time. And the limbs had gotten so low to the ground that you couldn't even walk up to my mom's grave. The tree limbs were in the way. And the limbs had fallen out of the trees, and they're just all over the place. The rain had washed. It was like a gully right past the grave marker. And I went to the office, and I said, I'd like to talk to somebody about some care for a grave. And they said, just fill out this form, and we'll take care of it. So I filled it out. And I talked to my sister sometime later, and she said, I went down to put flowers on the grave, and it's a mess. And they had me fill out a form, and she did the same thing I did, nothing happened. Well, the next time I was back visiting in Martinsville, I went by the cemetery again and then walked out there, and it was the same condition. So I just walked up to the office. I said, I'd like to talk to someone about the condition of a grave. Well, fill out this form. And I said, I've already done that. I said, I want to show somebody something. And the head's groundskeeper came out, and he said, what can I help you? I said, right, I want to go. He said, well, hop in the golf cart with me. And we rode the golf cart, went down the hill and pulled right up to where my mom's grave is. And all I did was I said, if this was your mom's grave, would you be happy? And his head just went. You see, I went there, and I go there just for respect. And that's what the women were doing. They went out of respect, but they weren't looking to see if Jesus had risen from the dead, no more than I was going to look and see if my mom had risen from the dead. See, Jesus didn't theorize about life after death. He said, I'll show you. I'll show you that there's life after death. And I'll be the one to do it. I'll be the one that the whole world sees that I'm dead, but I'll come back. When Paul was writing, continuing talking to these Christians in Corinth, he said this in 1 Corinthians 15. I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. This one kind of just says it just a little different. It says this. He says, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of all who have died. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man. In verse 22, it says, just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. Every so often we'll read in the news or it'll be on television that it's just somebody that's been exploring a cave, these beautiful ocean caves, and they'll go in and explore, and then the water rises and they get trapped. It seemed like it was just a few years ago, a whole group of people, like on a field trip, got trapped in one of these caves. I remember Bob Russell telling a story years ago, illustration about two people who went into one of these caves, and they got trapped inside, and the tide started coming in. The water was rising in the cave, and they're in this, like a chamber in this cave, and the water just keeps rising, and it's obvious they're going to drown, and one of them just finally says, when the water's just a few feet from being over their heads and up to the top, he says, I'm going to look for a way out. And he dove into the water, went under the water. 30 seconds, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. At 5 minutes that he had been gone, too long to have been holding his breath, he burst up out of the water and he says, I found a way out. He said, just a few feet down, there's another tunnel, and I swam into that, and it opens up to a big room, and there's light, and there's a way out. Follow me. What would you do? You know that he had to find air. He had to find a place because it's too long to hold your breath. I would go because I know my situation is hopeless without going. Hopeless. And I know that there's somebody leading me who's been to the other side. You see, Jesus disappeared into a cavern of death. And on the third day, he came back and said, follow me. I have the way to life after death. He proved that there was a life after death. Well, here's a second thing to think about. Jesus had to come back to life to demonstrate his authority. Just a few days before, he had said this to the Pharisees. And he said things like this all through his ministry. He says, I and the Father are one. The Father has sent me. And he said this, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it back. And they didn't understand what he was talking about. He was talking about, You destroy this temple, you take my life, and I'll build it back in 3 days. Jesus was determined to validate his claims of who he was. Jesus rose from the dead on a Sunday morning. The scripture tells us that, early in the morning. He made several appearances to people throughout that morning time, maybe afternoon. He appeared to several different people along the way. But it says that night that all of the disciples were gathered together, and Jesus appears to them there. And they're overjoyed to see Jesus. All of them were there except Thomas. And when Thomas does show up, Jesus is gone by this time. And when Thomas does show up, they're saying, man, you missed it. Jesus is alive. He was right here among us. And Thomas says, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe that it's Jesus when I can see the holes in his hands. I can put my hand when I can see into the side where they jabbed the spear into him. A whole week goes by, and they're back together. And this time Jesus appears again, but Thomas is there. And in John chapter 20, verse 27, it says this. Jesus says, then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Verse 28 says, Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. This past week, we saw the bridge collapse in Baltimore, Maryland, the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And immediately upon the bridge collapsing, there was a search and rescue effort that took place because they knew there were 8 people on the bridge that were there doing construction at 1:30 in the morning when this took place. And if you can imagine, if you were a family member, that was your dad, that was your grandfather, your husband, brother, that was on that bridge. And you're standing at the shore, and the boat comes up, and they found him. They've rescued him. He's alive, and he comes onto that shore. You would grab him. You would hug him. You would kiss him. You would not want to let go. But you wouldn't bow down and worship him. You wouldn't bow down at his feet and worship him. When Jesus appeared to the women the morning that he rose from the dead and he met them, that's what they did. They bowed down and worshiped him. It says they fell at his feet and worshiped him. When Thomas appeared to them, when Jesus appeared, when Thomas was there, it doesn't say Thomas goes, Jesus, you're back, and gives him a hug. It says, we knew you'd come back. He says, my Lord and my God. There's a difference. You recognize immediately the authority that's here. See, rising from the dead proves everything that Jesus said. It proves that he has all authority and power over life and death. And just put it this way, you rise from the dead to never die again, you can do about what you want to. You are the man. You the boss. As they talk about so much now, the GOAT, greatest of all time. That's the authority that he proved by doing that. And see, but this is so important for us. This is not just a feel-good moment where we cheer Jesus on and say, you defeat death, you show him Jesus. But this is a moment where we say, Jesus has all authority. And he has authority over me, and authority over my life and what I do. Matthew 28, Jesus, just last words he's given to his disciples as he's ascending back to the Father. Matthew 28, 18 and 19 says, then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go. Now we know what he said there. He said, therefore go. Tell this story. Preach it everywhere. Make disciples. Baptize people. Bring them to know me. But the truth is, he could have put anything after therefore. Because he is Jesus. Because he just defeated death. So whatever he says after therefore, it's our responsibility to obey. Here is go into the world and teach and preach, make disciples. But anything he says, that's his authority. Paul said in Philippians, he said, God the Father has given him the name that is above all names, and every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. And I said earlier that this is the pivotal moment in history. Everything hinges on Jesus rising from the dead. But we also come to a crossroads in our life where whether we accept this or not. Now, make no mistake, whether we accept Jesus Christ or not does not change the authority he has over life and death. He still has that authority whether we recognize it or not. But whether we accept it or not is the pivotal moment in our lives. When we do accept and submit to the authority of Jesus Christ, there's no sin that cannot be forgiven. There's no life that cannot be transformed. There is no Christian that will not live again with Jesus in heaven. When I was standing with that groundskeeper at the grave of my mother, and I just said, would you be happy if this was your mom's grave? After he kept his head down for just a second or two, he looked up at me and he said, I'll take care of this. And I told him this. I said, I don't live here anymore, but I do come back and visit. And I'll be back. And the first thing I'm going to do when I come back to visit is I'm going to come to this cemetery. And I'm going to come and stand right where I'm standing today. And I'll know right at that moment if you're a man of your word. I came back, I think it was about 2 months later. First thing I did was when I pulled into Martinsville, drove right to the cemetery, walked down that hill, and I stood at my mom's grave with a tree that had been trimmed away, all the sticks picked up, and dirt brought in and filled in around that grave marker. I didn't think about it then, but I thought about it this week. Is that not the same thing that Jesus says to us? I'm going away. I don't live here anymore, but I am coming back. And I'll find out then if you're a person of your word. Have you submitted to the authority of Jesus Christ?